The heavy southern air still clung to the early morning streets of Savannah as I pulled into the familiar circular driveway of my parents' grand estate. It was barely 6:30 a.m., but I had timed it perfectly to avoid any awkward run-ins. The mansion sat stoic under the pale orange glow of dawn, the same stately home where I had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and every milestone until now. I grabbed the bakery box and the freshly printed invitations from the passenger seat, my heart oddly calm despite the whirlwind of wedding preparations these past few weeks. I had no reason to suspect that in the next few minutes my life would be detonated into something unrecognizable. The side door creaked faintly as I let myself in, the way I always had since high school. The house was silent, too silent. No faint hum of the television, no clinking of Mom's favorite china cup, no footsteps overhead. My heels echoed on the polished mahogany floors as I walked toward the kitchen, instinctively expecting to find one of her little cheerful notes taped to the counter, reminders about final dress fittings or seating charts. Instead, a single sheet of paper lay perfectly folded on the kitchen island. Thick white cardstock, no frills, just cold, black ink slashed across the center. Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The words burned into my brain like acid, each one pulling at the seams of my reality. My parents had canceled my wedding by note. No call, no explanation, no signature. My hands trembled as I unfolded it again, as if reading it a second time would somehow change what was already irreversible. Nothing. No warmth. No apology. Just execution. The box of cake samples slipped from my grasp, landing soundlessly on the countertop. I stood there for what must have been minutes, unmoving, my mind clawing through the last few weeks for answers. Was it the argument about the guest list? The time I refused to let Samantha bring her new boyfriend at the last minute? No, this wasn't impulsive. Someone had planned this, deliberately, methodically. My parents didn't just pull the rug out from under me. They had sewn it into a noose and tightened it with a smile. I should have screamed, cried, called Evan, but I didn't. I pulled my phone from my purse and typed one word to my mother. Understood. I slid the phone back into my bag and walked to the door. The streets outside remained hauntingly still, the trees swaying in the faint morning breeze, like silent witnesses to my humiliation. I drove home through empty streets, headlights casting long shadows that seemed to mock me at every turn. I couldn't hear the engine, couldn't feel the wheel in my hands. It was as though my body stayed behind at that kitchen counter, locked in that frozen second of betrayal. The sun began to rise over the marshes as I pulled into my driveway, painting everything in soft gold. I got out, walked into my small apartment, and sat on the couch, still in my coat, still in my heels. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at the wall, the weight of 7 simple words pressing down on me harder than anything I had ever known. I whispered, barely audible even to myself. They really did it, the silence answered back. I must have sat there for hours. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the occasional creak of old pipes or the distant screech of tires from the street below. My phone lay face down on the coffee table. I stared blankly at the empty space in front of me, replaying every conversation, every email, every meeting over the past 12 months. How had I missed the signs? How had I trusted them with everything? The deposits, the contracts, the vendor schedules. I let out a hollow laugh that barely rose above a whisper because they were family, because I believed it was easier that way. The phone buzzed once, then again. I didn't want to look. My mind told me to leave it there, untouched, like the last fragile boundary between me and whatever fresh hell awaited. But curiosity won. It was a text from Paige, my cousin, my only neutral family member. I frowned. The message said simply, "Hey, I think this was sent to me by mistake. You need to see this." Attached was a screenshot of a group chat. Whitaker family wedding changes. My stomach twisted as I tapped to enlarge the image. There were names I recognized immediately: Vivian, Henry, Samantha, even some of the vendors' contacts I had personally introduced. As my eyes darted down the conversation thread, the reality of it struck harder than the paper had. My wedding had been reassigned. The venue? The florist? The photographer? The same exact plans I had worked on for months now had Samantha and Zach's names on every line item. I scrolled further, heart racing. There it was, Samantha's smug message. At least now the photos will actually be cute, followed by a red heart emoji for my mother. My hand trembled. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, raw fury that burned through my veins. They hadn't just removed me. They had replaced me, as if I were a placeholder, an inconvenience they could simply swap out when it suited them. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, unable to tear my eyes away from the digital evidence of my erasure. I read the thread again and again, trying to find some trace of guilt, of hesitation, of regret. There was none, only casual cruelty, disguised as family planning. The betrayal cut deep, like someone peeling away my skin layer by layer, all while smiling politely. I let the phone fall onto the couch beside me. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I whispered out loud into the heavy silence. They really planned this. They planned every inch of this. My breathing slowed, but the cold realization settled deeper. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. They never intended to share the spotlight with me. They had been quietly moving the pieces behind my back for months, and I had been too blind to see it. I sat motionless as the morning light crept across the floorboards of my small apartment. The city of Savannah had long since awakened around me, but inside I remained paralyzed by the weight of what I had just read. Slowly, as though peeling back layers of a long-forgotten memory, I began to see the pattern. This hadn't started yesterday, not even last week. This had been years in the making. I leaned back against the couch, staring up at the cracked ceiling, and let my mind drift. 2 weeks earlier, I had stood in the fitting room at Charleston Couture, the boutique my mother insisted I use because it was where all respectable families went. I had tried to believe it was about tradition, about love, about them caring for me. But standing there half-dressed with pins still biting into my skin, I knew something was off. My mother hadn't shown up. Not once. She always had an excuse. My calls went unanswered. Instead, Samantha breezed in 40 minutes late, Starbucks cup in hand, acting surprised to see me. "Oh, I didn't know you were scheduled for today," she had laughed, settling onto the velvet bench like it was a front-row seat. I remembered the way she stared at her phone, casually scrolling through photos while I awkwardly twirled in the mirror in a half-finished dress. I had tried to brush off the unease, tried to ignore the way the boutique owner seemed confused when Samantha gave her updated measurements after I left. A few days later, the boutique emailed me. Final adjustments were complete. For Samantha Whitaker. My name was gone from the invoice. When I called to clarify, the assistant chirped back cheerfully, "Oh, your family called and said there were changes." The word sliced through me even now. Family. I had believed it meant safety, support, unconditional love, but in reality, it had become the sharpest knife. My memory jumped back further. The time my mother insisted I choose a neutral wedding gown so it wouldn't overshadow the room. My father reassuring me, "Don't worry, sweetie, we've got it covered," when I questioned the deposit transfers. The dozens of tiny moments over the years when I was coached, corrected, reshaped into the obedient version of myself they wanted. I shook my head slowly, the cold truth settling deeper than ever. They hadn't pulled the rug out from under me. They had spent years weaving it so tightly around my ankles that I never even noticed until I couldn't move anymore. I stood up abruptly and walked to my small desk. My laptop sat there waiting, silent and unassuming, like a soldier before battle. I opened it and created a new folder on the desktop. I named it for the record. My hands moved without hesitation now. Screenshots. emails, contracts, receipts, anything and everything that could serve as proof. I wasn't doing this for sympathy. I wasn't even doing it to convince anyone else. I was doing it for me, so that one day when they tried to rewrite history, I would have the truth, every single piece of it. I whispered under my breath as the files began to fill the folder. They think I won't fight back. That's the only thing they got wrong. The glow of the laptop screen cast a cold light over my apartment as I sat frozen, staring at the folder slowly filling with evidence. A quiet calm began to settle over me, not the comfort of acceptance, but the icy resolve of knowing there was no going back. They had taken my wedding, my trust, my dignity, but they weren't going to take my truth. I scrolled mindlessly until, out of bitter curiosity, I tapped open the boutique's Instagram page. There, among autumn leaves and perfectly curated captions, was a newly posted reel. My breath caught in my chest. I watched stunned as Samantha twirled on the dance floor, wearing the exact lace gown I had paid for, beneath the soft golden lights of the same historic venue I had painstakingly booked. The string quartet played Clair de Lune, the very song I had handpicked months earlier for my own entrance. The camera panned slowly to capture Samantha beaming as my mother dabbed at fake tears, my father raising his glass to Zach as if the past year had never existed. Everything was flawless. Everything was mine, and I had been erased. Not a single mention. Not a stray photo of me tucked away in the corner. Not even a tag. I wasn't just excluded. I was non-existent, an unperson in my own family's fairy tale. The comments flooded in beneath the video like celebratory confetti. She's glowing. What a stunning bride. This family really knows how to throw a wedding. I stared at the screen, numb. The irony nearly made me laugh. They had taken the most important day of my life and turned it into a magazine spread for Samantha. The betrayal wasn't just theft, it was annihilation. My breathing became shallow, my pulse hammering against my ribs as the realization fully sank in. They had never intended for me to be part of their perfect picture. I had simply been a backup plan, a shadow standing in place until their preferred daughter was ready. I sat back slowly, running a hand through my hair, my fingers tangling with frustration. My phone lay beside me, cold and silent. I stared at it, torn between dialing Evan and shielding him from the mess. Instead, I picked it up and whispered, "They really did it," before setting it back down untouched. The bitterness didn't burn as it once would have. It froze solid, sharp, indestructible. I clicked open the digital folder again, dragging the video into the growing pile of evidence. They thought they had erased me, but I had just begun to carve the outline of my own story. I whispered to the empty room, the weight of the betrayal slowly crystallizing into resolve. You wanted me gone. Now I'm the only one who remembers everything. The next morning, sunlight spilled indifferently through the slats of my apartment blinds as I sat staring at my untouched coffee. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten. I simply sat, reliving the silent dismembering of my life, piece by calculated piece. That's when my phone rang. An unknown number lit up the screen. I almost let it go, almost. But something deep inside told me to answer. I pressed accept. Hello. My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end froze me in place. Allison? It's Brandon. Brandon Ellis. The man I had once loved more than anyone. The man who vanished 6 years earlier without explanation, breaking me at a time when I had barely learned how to stand on my own. The air rushed out of my lungs in a single breath. I gripped the phone tighter, bracing myself. He continued, quickly, nervous. I heard about your wedding. I thought maybe now you should know what really happened back then. The world tilted slightly as I listened. Brandon's words didn't rush. They tumbled, cracked, as if releasing the guilt he had carried all these years. She threatened me, Allison, your mother. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't speak. I didn't interrupt. I just listened as my heart pounded against my ribs. He explained it all. How Vivian had called his office, warned his manager that he was dating someone with mental instability, hinted that I needed constant care, and suggested the relationship was endangering my fragile state. She painted him as an enabler, someone harming me. She told him that if he truly loved me, he would let me go for my own good. I clenched my free hand so tightly my knuckles turned white. I believed her, he whispered, voice cracking. I thought walking away was protecting you. I thought she was right. I exhaled slowly, staring out my window as children rode their bikes down the street, carefree and oblivious. My voice came out steady but cold. She wasn't protecting me, Brandon, she was controlling me. He fell silent, the weight of his confession heavy between us. I'm sorry, Allison. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thank you, I said simply. No venom, no dramatics. Just finality. When the call ended, I set the phone down and stared out into the bright Savannah morning. The fog that had clung to my memories for years finally began to clear, and what I saw beneath it was chilling. This hadn't just been about a wedding. This had been years of quiet, methodical sabotage. I stood slowly, my legs stiff, walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of my apartment, and pulled out old documents I had nearly forgotten existed. Venue contracts, florist deposits, spreadsheets my mother had offered to manage for me. Every page told the same story. Erasure. Quiet, polite, systematic erasure. I whispered it aloud for the first time. Not rhetorical, but urgent, like a puzzle finally snapping into place. What else have they taken? The answer came quicker than I expected. As I sifted through the carefully curated chaos of old folders, one cream-colored envelope caught my eye. It was tucked behind my nonprofit's bank statements, the same nonprofit account I had opened 5 years earlier to fund small community projects. I pulled it out cautiously, my pulse quickening as I unfolded the document. The heading read, Authorized Financial Reassignment for Family Redistribution Purposes. My stomach dropped. I traced my own signature, scrawled in rushed ink months ago, naively thinking it was just a budgeting agreement to help keep expenses organized, as my mother had insisted. Now I saw it for what it was. A legal document transferring control of my wedding deposits, vendor payments, and even personal funds into an account controlled by my parents. I staggered back a step, gripping the edge of my kitchen table for balance. I had signed away my own wedding, my own money, my own autonomy, without ever realizing the trap that had been set. I stood frozen in place for what felt like hours, eyes locked on the paper. Then something inside me shifted. Not rage, not despair. Focus. Cold, sharp focus. I turned back to the desk and opened my laptop with steady hands. A new folder sprang to life on the screen. I titled it simply Restitution. I moved methodically, dragging files from one folder to the next. Vendor contracts, email threads with Samantha about reimbursements she never paid, invoices for floral arrangements under my nonprofit account, screenshots of text messages with Vivian where she promised to help keep things organized for you. The evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't chaos, it had been strategy. I had trusted them to help me plan the happiest day of my life. They had used that trust as a weapon. At the top of the document stack, I laid the financial reassignment contract, my signature above the fatal line. I stared at it for a long time, then slid it into a plastic sleeve and added it to the growing binder labeled Ledger of Record. I sat down at the table and stared into the empty space of my kitchen. The overhead light hummed softly. The apartment was silent, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt like the calm before a storm. I opened my email and typed a message addressed to my mother. Subject line, "This ends now." The body of the email was short, sharp, precise. "You've taken enough from me. If you continue, I will take back everything. Legally, publicly, permanently. Consider this your last warning." I hovered my cursor over the send button. I thought of the years I had been silenced, minimized, molded into something easy to control. Then I clicked. The tension in my chest loosened ever so slightly, not because I believed it was over, but because for the first time in years, I had finally started. The storm was coming, and I was ready. The reply didn't come in the form of an email. It came in the form of a Facebook notification hours later. I stood at my kitchen counter with a mug of lukewarm tea, the familiar chime vibrating against the granite surface. I stared at the screen for a full minute before unlocking it. I already knew what I was about to see. Samantha's smiling profile photo greeted me beneath the words, "New post." I clicked. The post was long, rehearsed, the kind of carefully constructed narrative someone writes not at a keyboard, but aloud in front of a mirror. Some people can't stand not being the center of attention. It began. For years, I've tried to support my sister despite her struggles with emotional instability and unpredictable behavior. Sadly, I've had to make the painful decision to distance myself from my own mental health. I scrolled, breath shallow, as the words blurred into weaponized character assassination. She accused me of undermining family events, spreading lies about her and my parents, and having a history of jealousy and irrational behavior. Vivian had liked the post. My father had left a heart emoji. I stood there numb, watching as mutual family friends, former classmates, even distant neighbors chimed in beneath the post. "So, sorry you have to deal with that, Samantha. You've always been the strong one. Some people just can't let go of the past." It wasn't just an attack. It was a coordinated exile. They weren't trying to argue with me anymore. They were trying to erase me in front of everyone I had ever known. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw the phone across the room like I might have years earlier. Instead, I opened my screenshot tool. I captured every comment, every reaction, every timestamp. I saved them methodically into my restitution folder under a new subfolder titled Defamation. They wanted to silence me by shame. What they didn't understand was that shame only works if you believe you've done something wrong. I hadn't. Later that evening, I sat across from my phone, debating whether to call Lauren. She had always been my one safe space, my one friend outside the toxic pull of my family. I finally tapped her name. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight, cautious. "Allison, hey!" I kept it simple. "You saw it." A long pause, then a soft sigh. "Yeah, I did. Would you want to meet up?" I could use a familiar face. Her inhale was sharp, like she was about to deliver news neither of us wanted to hear. "I don't think that's a good idea. I'm sorry. Your mom has too many connections. She helped my cousin get that internship at the law firm, and after what happened with your aunt's will, I can't risk it." The words hit like ice water. Not betrayal. Confirmation. Vivian's power didn't end at the front door. It bled through Savannah like a quiet current no one dared swim against. I smiled faintly into the phone, though my heart ached. No hard feelings. I hung up, alone again. But for the first time, the isolation didn't crush me. It clarified everything. The storm wasn't over, but I had never been more ready to walk straight into it. The next morning brought the storm to my doorstep, not as thunder or rain, but as the sharp, deliberate knock of a courier at 9:26 a.m. I opened the door to find a man in a tailored gray blazer, holding a document tube and a clipboard. His expression was neutral, professional, detached from the chaos he was about to deliver. "Allison Whitaker?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "You've been served." He handed me the envelope, had me sign, and walked briskly away before I could form a single word. I stared at the heavy weight of it in my hands, then closed the door and carried it to the kitchen table as though it were ticking. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and slid the papers free. Across the top, bold and unapologetic, "Whitaker versus Whitaker civil complaint." I read the contents, my stomach tightening with every line. They were suing me. My own parents and sister were accusing me of embezzlement of family funds, unauthorized upgrades to venue arrangements, repeated emotional instability, making me unfit to manage financial matters. It read like the script of a bad courtroom drama where I was cast as the unstable villain. I sat frozen, my pulse pounding against my temples. I looked down at my hands, steady and calm. I had been through worse. I was done being the helpless daughter waiting for someone to rescue me. I walked to my laptop, opened my email, and typed, subject, defamation claim, Whitaker family. The body of the message was simple and factual. Add this filing to our counterclaim. Defamation, malicious intent, reputational damage. Let's respond swiftly. I hit send, then closed the lid of my laptop with a soft, decisive click. I didn't want revenge that burned fast and loud like a house fire. I wanted revenge with weight, precision, and permanence, the kind of revenge that came with a docket number. The day passed in measured quiet. I printed contracts showing every payment that had come directly from my personal accounts. I compiled screenshots of messages from Samantha, promising to repay me for shared expenses. I dug out digital contracts signed in my name by vendors they had later credited to themselves. I didn't plan to post any of it publicly. Not yet, but I wanted it ready. People like my family didn't fear confrontation. They feared documentation. And that was the one thing I had never stopped collecting. As the sun lowered behind the Spanish moss outside my window, I poured a cup of tea and sat back at the kitchen table. I didn't shake as I sipped. I didn't flinch. I wasn't waiting for them to fix it anymore. I wasn't even waiting for justice. I was building my case, brick by brick. Morning came cloaked in the heavy humidity of Savannah's late September. I dressed with intent. A simple slate gray blouse, black tailored pants, low heels. Forgettable, professional, unshakable. I wasn't going to court to make a statement. I was going to stand tall when they expected me to crumble. At 8:50 a.m., I walked briskly into the marble-tiled courthouse on Bull Street. The walls loomed pale green and sterile, the kind of color designed to calm tempers. My shoes echoed softly as I walked past rows of benches filled with strangers waiting for their own verdicts. Courtroom 204. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Samantha was already seated at the far end, sharply dressed but visibly restless, legs crossing and uncrossing under the table. Henry sat beside her, stone-faced and stiff, avoiding my gaze entirely. Vivian lingered near the back wall, arms crossed, gripping a slim stack of papers so tightly her knuckles blanched white. The bailiff called our case. I stood as my attorney calmly took his place at my side. The judge entered, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her voice sharp and no nonsense. She stared over her glasses as she addressed the room. This is not a reality show. This is civil court. Facts only. The room fell silent. My attorney began, slowly and methodically laying out her evidence. Every payment, every document, every text message, screenshots of Samantha agreeing to reimburse me for venue deposits, invoices from my nonprofit account paying for floral arrangements, digital contracts signed under my name. I listened without speaking, my heart steady, my breathing measured. When it was their turn, Vivian's attorney shifted tactics, claiming I was emotionally unstable and had been obsessively controlling the wedding planning process. The judge raised one eyebrow and asked plainly, "Do you have any clinical documentation to support this claim?" The lawyer paused. There was none. The silence in the room was deafening. I glanced briefly across the aisle. Samantha stared ahead, cheeks flushed, jaw clenched. Vivian refused to meet my eyes. Henry stared at the floor as though it might swallow him whole. After hours of presentations, the judge spoke the words I had waited so long to hear. Independent audits will be conducted. Ms. Allison Whitaker is granted temporary legal authority over all disputed funds until mediation is complete. The gavel didn't slam dramatically. There was no gasp from the gallery, just a quiet, powerful confirmation that the truth had weight. I rose calmly. I didn't smile. This wasn't about victory. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standing. Standing when they had tried everything to make me fall. As I walked past the family I no longer recognized, Vivian shifted slightly in her chair, clutching her papers tighter. Samantha's lawyer whispered furiously to her, but she didn't respond. Henry never looked up. I pushed open the heavy courtroom doors into the blinding afternoon sun, and I exhaled. For the first time in months, my breath felt full. The fight wasn't over, but I had survived the first round. 2 weeks later, the drive to my parents' estate felt both familiar and foreign. The towering oak trees that lined the private road, draped in Spanish moss, whispered softly in the breeze like judgmental witnesses awaiting the final act. I parked at the edge of the circular driveway, staring for a long moment at the house that had once been home, and now was just another structure. Clutching a manila folder under my arm, I walked deliberately up the steps, my low heels making sharp clicks against the stone. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I simply opened the door and stepped inside one last time. The scent hit me immediately. Lemon polish, fresh-cut flowers, and something colder, the lingering weight of a family that had already decided I didn't belong. I passed the living room where holiday parties had once filled the air with laughter. The dining room table where countless forced conversations had taught me how to smile through disappointment. The staircase I had sat on as a teenager, tears silently falling, wondering why I was always too much. At the kitchen table, I laid the folder down. Inside were the signed settlement papers and a formal release removing my name from the deed to the family property. I pulled my old house keys from my coat pocket and set them gently on top. There was no need to say goodbye. I knew no one would come rushing to stop me. I turned slowly, walking back through the house with a final glance at my childhood bedroom door. I didn't feel the expected sadness. I didn't feel rage. I felt release. As I stepped outside, the door clicked shut behind me with a soft finality that echoed louder than any slammed door ever could. I stood for a second, staring up at the grand facade that had once defined my existence, and realized it held no power over me anymore. The sun broke through the clouds just as I reached my car. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel firmly as the realization settled into my bones. I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking away on my own terms. And for the first time in my life, I felt weightless. 3 days after I returned to my quiet apartment, an unmarked envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, no handwritten note, just a cashier's check slipped inside. I unfolded it slowly, expecting another legal demand or a thinly veiled threat. Instead, the check stared back at me in cold, impersonal font. Pay to the order of Allison Whitaker, $31,320. Memo: reimbursement for dress, venue, and emotional damages. I stared at it in stunned silence. The amount matched exactly what I had tallied months ago in my private spreadsheet. Every stolen vendor fee, every loan for family deposits that was never paid back. They knew. They had always known. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, tracing my fingers over the paper, but not with the satisfaction they might have expected. There was no apology, no signature, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was not an admission of guilt. It was a desperate attempt to close the book. I didn't cash it. I couldn't. Instead, I bought a small brass frame with an engraved plate beneath the glass, proof they knew. The check now sits on my bookshelf, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't exaggerated. I had lived through it, and I had survived. Later that week, as I sipped coffee on a crisp autumn morning by the river, my phone buzzed. Lauren's name lit up the screen. I answered cautiously. Her voice was lighter than it had been in weeks. I saw what you did. You really did it. I smiled faintly, watching ducks glide across the glassy water. Yeah, I did. There was a pause, then her voice softened. If you ever need a partner for what's next, I'm in. I stared out across the horizon as the morning sun painted the Savannah skyline in soft gold. My laptop was already open on the cafe table, the cursor blinking expectantly in a blank document titled Whitaker and Ellis Advocacy Group, Legal and Crisis Support for Women Silenced by Family Abuse. The idea had been brewing since that day in the courthouse. For every woman like me who found her way through the noise, there were 10 more still trapped inside it, questioning if they were the problem. I typed the first sentence of our mission statement and whispered it aloud. Freedom isn't loud, I smiled. Sometimes it's just the sound of no one calling you back. The days that followed unfolded like the gentle unfurling of a long-forgotten bloom. For the first time in years, my life belonged entirely to me. There were no passive-aggressive texts, no veiled manipulations disguised as motherly advice, no random demands for explanations of decisions that were never theirs to question. The silence was absolute, but instead of feeling like exile, it felt like oxygen. I spent mornings walking the shaded streets of Savannah, letting the wind carry away what remained of the weight I had carried for far too long. I rearranged my apartment. I replaced old framed family photos with landscapes of places I dreamed of visiting. I donated the engagement gifts still boxed in my closet. I erased the future they had designed for me and sketched the first lines of one that was mine alone. There were no headlines, no grand confrontations, just the quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming myself inch by inch. I realized then that the battles that define us are not always the ones fought loudly in courtrooms or across dinner tables. Sometimes they are the silent choices made in the privacy of an empty room, to stand firm, to say no, to let go. One late afternoon, I stood at the large window of my apartment as the golden light spilled through, catching dust motes suspended in air like stars. I rested my hand against the glass, breathing deeply as the world outside moved on without me having to participate. I was not waiting for their apology anymore. I was not expecting closure, wrapped neatly with a bow. I had built my own. The person who had once been herself in every possible shape to be accepted had ceased to exist. In her place stood someone solid, sharp-edged, and whole. They had tried to erase me. They had written me out of the family narrative with ink they thought permanent, but I had become the author of my own ending. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I whispered into the gathering dusk, knowing no one would answer, yet knowing the answer had already arrived. I didn't win by hurting them. I won by stepping away,